We're talking about Enlightenment, which is Enlightenment. Fingers crossed that was correctly spelled.
Okay, well the normal definition that's given for the Age of Enlightenment is that it was also the age of reason. The idea was that in the Enlightenment, more than ever before, people looked to reason to explain things.
The philosopher Kant refers to Enlightenment as the period, the point in time, the point in history when, as he puts it, mankind, and he uses the term mankind, grows out of its self-imposed immaturity.
Well, the Enlightenment is the term we use for the period from sometime in the 17th century, depending where you want to set it, right through the 18th century, which is the peak of the Enlightenment. Some people like to cut it off in 1789 with the French Revolution, and others would let it slip into the 19th century to have a nice long Enlightenment period.
If you think of medieval Christendom in Europe as the parent, the secular society in Europe, which is born, if you want, in the Renaissance, is the child, which then reaches maturity in the period of Enlightenment. And the idea of Enlightenment is that this is the point at which people begin to want to think for themselves.
And I think what's maybe different in the 18th century and in the Enlightenment is that reason becomes divorced from any kind of theological implication, not by everyone, by all means, but for particular thinkers who gained increasing popularity.
People sometimes see the Enlightenment as defining Europe, and it is a pan-European phenomenon, and that includes Eastern Europe as well as Western Europe. But also North America. I think America, what will become the United States, is important in the Enlightenment as well.
There's a Latin phrase that's often used, and Kant uses it himself, aude sapere, dare to know, dare to think for yourself. And obviously one of the implications there is that you free yourself from, for example, religious dogma. So it's no longer religion that tells you what to do. You rely on your own resources. You rely on the resources of rational thought.
I think people usually would say it's a ferment of ideas. It's ideas that spur people on to challenge authority, to challenge whether it's the authority of past ideas, now regarded as prejudices, préjugés, as the French would put it, superstitions. Well, Enlightenment is obviously the English term and about the bringing of light. In French, you've got the Lumière, again, light in the plural, Aufklärung in German, Illuminismo in Italian. You've got this theme of light in all these different terms for that period, and it is about the light of reason.
People believed that reason would shed light on areas of ignorance or abuses, whether that be religious abuses or political abuses.
One of the most famous texts in the 18th century to use the word is actually the German version. There's a very well-known essay by Kant.
It's largely a term that was applied retrospectively. You have, by 1784, you have Kant writes an essay called Was ist Aufklärung, which is essentially what is Enlightenment. So by that time, this term was beginning to be known.
Some people would see the Enlightenment as simply a continuation of the Renaissance. The Renaissance invents itself against the Middle Ages, which are often seen as a period of darkness and submission to authority of the church and authority of the monarchy. And then that, I think a medievalist might want to challenge that representation of the Middle Ages, but if we just take it for now that that's how it was seen by the Renaissance, that rebelled against it and brought in a sense of something more natural, more around individuals. But still in the Renaissance, you do have a very strong hold of religion over people's lives. And I suppose the difference with the Enlightenment, it's a continuation of the Renaissance, but it's a much stronger, much fiercer challenge, particularly with people like, say, Voltaire, Diderot, and Rousseau in a different way. Rousseau is less concerned with attacking religion and more concerned with attacking inequality.
People who we would call Enlightenment philosophers today, so people like Voltaire, Diderot, in terms of the French Enlightenment, looked back, in terms of their own view of their history, looked back to people like Newton, people like Locke, and Descartes. I think they are sort of the three key figures. So Newton was held to be really important because he discovered the law of gravity. He showed people how the world worked.
Some people would argue there's an ending to it with the French Revolution. You've already had the American Revolution, which is, 'cause it's a revolutionary century in some ways. And then in 1789 you have that extraordinary event, which is the French Revolution. So some people would see that as an ending to the Enlightenment.
I think Diderot for the French Enlightenment is brilliant. I mean, he's not by any means a systematic thinker. In fact, many of the philosophes of the Enlightenment weren't. They didn't set out to be. But what's exciting about Diderot is the sheer variety of things he writes. He writes essays, and he writes plays, and he writes theatre criticism, and he writes art criticism, and he writes novels, and he writes pornography, and he writes kind of philosophical texts. Just such a variety of things, and you can just, when you're reading him, he's just so interested in everything.
We mustn't forget that this is a period which also has a sort of dark side to it, that while, as people would put it, white European men are arguing for their freedom vis-à-vis the king and the church, what about the fact that this is the period when there's the greatest amount of people transported as slaves that there has ever been? It is the peak of slaving, and even somebody like Voltaire, who's an icon of Enlightenment, is indirectly making money out of the slave trade. It's a period of enslavement. It's a period when you could say the way is being prepared for colonialism. You've got settler colonialism already in the New World, but you could argue that it's preparing the way for 19th century imperialism.